Hello, today I want to tell you how this magnificent beast came into being, and that's going to take us on a voyage back in time to the 80s. Do you remember the 80s? Were you around in the 80s? Back in the late 80s I had a Commodore 64, and games on the Commodore 64 looked like this. And at that same time, games in the arcade looked like this. Right, so there was quite some difference, and technology was moving on at a rapid rate. We went from like Space Invaders in 1978 to like Outrun and Afterburner by the late 80s, to Street Fighter and Virtua Racing in the early 90s, to like Wipeout and so on by the mid 90s. Technology was moving incredibly rapidly, and the computer games you could play at home were a pale, sorry imitation of the stuff you could get in the arcades. And so because of that, the arcade scene had a certain level of glamour and mystery about it, because it was like looking into the future. You were seeing that a cutting edge technology, and the difference between that and what you could play on your TV in your living room was just out of this world. And then we moved on into the 90s, and the scene changed a little bit. 3D consoles started coming out. On the Nintendo 64 we had a fully actual 3D version of Mario Kart, and then the PlayStation 1 wowed the world with Gran Turismo and Wipeout, and then the PC went mega 3D with Doom, which set the tone for every game released on the PC for the next 2 decades. And so the arcade started to fade away, because you could now play the most amazing games in your living room, and the lure of the arcades faded. Come the 2000s, things evolved and moved on again. We had more and more Doom clones, and we had a lot more complex, long-form games on the next generation of consoles, and they were great and all, but at some point missed that short, simple hit of earlier days, right? The 3 lives over in 2 minutes, super adrenaline rush gameplay that we saw in the 80s with the arcade games. And you just couldn't get those kind of games on, really, not that much, on the modern hardware of the day. And along came the emulation scene. At some point all these different emulators started popping up on the PC, and the most groundbreaking of all, of course, was MAME, because you could play actual arcade games again at home on your computer. There was a bit of a downside to this though, because joysticks for PCs at that time were all these analog flight sticks. You couldn't get, they didn't have these mega arcade sticks that you have today. And so most people played computer games using a keyboard, and keyboard input is rubbish for playing R-Type or Street Fighter, Black Matter. It just doesn't work the same as having a great big clicky arcade joystick and all the big clicky buttons. And at the same time as this, kind of quietly in the background and in Japan, arcade games were still quietly evolving. And it turns out I had a PlayStation 2 at this point in the early 2000s, and so you could actually get hold of some of these games. There were Japanese shoot 'em ups you could get hold of, and they all had unpronounceable names like Mushihime-sama, Dodonpachi, ESP Galuda. So this was the first way of scratching that itch, that desire to go and recapture the arcade sensations. And I could do better than that. On some of these games, especially the Japanese imports, you could put them in tate mode, which meant they would be in vertical format picture, and they would turn it sideways on the screen. So you could have a large scale vertical picture by turning your TV up on one side and sticking it on the floor. So I did that with my new LCD TV. I don't think it liked it very much. And to supplement the experience, we also had the Namco arcade stick. I'm sure I've got a picture of that somewhere, which had something very similar to an actual arcade machine joystick on it, and the clicky buttons, like the classic 6-button layout. And all of these PlayStation 2 arcade games supported this. So that was pretty good. But it was a limited number of games. I think I had 3 Japanese import shoot 'em ups, and then there were like 4 or 5 others that had a UK release. What am I thinking? There was Raiden 3, one called Cyvaria, a couple of others, but they were few and far between, and some of the PlayStation 2 conversions weren't fantastic. So we had this limited range of games available. Now, on the PC, as I said, most people were using keyboard controls, but you did have the ability to play all these arcade games on there using MAME. So around this time in the early 2000s, a new craze kind of emerged on the scene, and there were websites specifically for this, and this was to do with building your own arcade controls, right? You could actually buy, we had still do have a supplier in the UK, there's probably loads now, where you could buy controller packs and buttons and joysticks and spinners and arcade trackballs and all this kind of things. And so you'd see online on the Build Your Own Arcade Controls forums, you'd see pictures of all people's projects, like huge 4-player control panels for Gauntlet and The Simpsons, or panels with spinners on them for playing Arkanoid or Tempest. Yeah, you could get hold of arcade trackballs, which people use for Crystal Castles and Golden Tee, the golf game. And some people just went absolutely crazy, and you'd have these like ridiculous Frankenstein panels with everything on it. As you could probably tell where this is going, right? So I got bitten by the bug, and I thought, I think I'm going to have a go at this. So I did. I dipped my toe in the water, and I built a thing that I had now come to lovingly call the Slab, and I'll go and get it for you. So this major monstrosity, I'm going to have to make room for this. This is the Slab. So this it's basically just an enormous, extremely unstylish but wooden box with 2-player controls on it and piece de resistance, a very, by now, quite tatty and old arcade trackball. And this really had the electronics inside it, converted all of that into basically a USB keyboard and a USB mouse. So we had two USB sockets, one for the keyboard and one for the mouse. So this would work with MAME. And as you'll see on the back, my super world-class electronics, you had trackball here that went into its own analog sort of mouse controller board, and then all of the buttons and joysticks went into this separate board that handled all the keyboard, basically emulated a keyboard. And then we've got all the lovely, still organised wiring, and there we go. This thing still works. It's amazing, and it's really good fun. You can play 2-player, like anything you like Street Fighter as well, because it has, if I move it from side to side, you can see it's got the classic six button layout. And so this was the beginning of my journey into madness of making arcade computer game related bits and pieces. I think I'm going to clear this off the desk right now because it's taking up a ridiculous amount of room. As you can see, miniaturization, not really a thing here. But that was just the start, right? So the next thing had to be, right, well, I've got a control panel and it works and it's great, and I'm plugging it into my PC. What do we do with that? We turn that into an actual cabinet. Imagine having an arcade cabinet in your house. I was single at this point, so like the madness could go unwitnessed. So I had I made a start and I made the beginnings of a cabinet, and I based it on an old like low format 1942 cabinet, and I had a nice big 4x3 monitor. Right, they were still a thing at this point. And I quickly realised that maybe I wasn't too happy about this. I didn't really want a great clunking, great empty, mostly empty box with a noisy PC sitting in the bottom of it, taking up big space in the living room. The appeal of that, if it was going to be worth it, it would have to look really good with, like, you know, good lighting up marquees and all that kind of thing. And I think at the time my carpentry skills were definitely not up to that level of flashiness. And also, I was quite attracted by the idea of going miniature. Somebody had posted online around this time, the early 2000s, these little like paper plans for making your own paper arcade machines that you could just like construct and stick on your desk as like little silly desk decorations. And I quite liked that idea, but I thought, oh, I did have a go of making them just for inspiration. I've got a photo somewhere of a whole row of them up on top of my notice board. But, you know, if they're just a decoration, that's not much good. We want something that's going to actually work, right? So at this point, we're talking, what are we, like 20 odd years ago, 25 years ago, like miniaturization, like hobby electronics, hadn't come along to where it is now. So we couldn't really go super small, right? We certainly didn't have these kind of things where you can play arcade games on a little Linux powered thing that could just go in your pocket. Not yet, anyway. It was coming. It was coming, but it wasn't quite there. Right. Well, you didn't have things like this, but there were the very early stages of the scene of these portable devices. A device had just been released out of Korea called the GP2X. And it had a predecessor, the GP32, and I had both of these. I got both of these because these look kind of interesting. So the GP2X was a little handheld device. I don't have it anymore. I sold it off a few years back, and it was very low powered. Right, this was 20 years ago. I think it was ARM. Had a really low powered ARM processor in it. But the great thing about it, it ran on Linux and it was open source. So like there was an enthusiast scene built up, and hackers wrote games and programs for it, and very soon somebody ported a very early version of MAME for it called MAME for All, and it ran a very early, very limited ROM set. So because the processing power of this thing was not great, but it could run some of the really basic ROMs like Space Invaders and Asteroids and Tempest and a few like that. But it really couldn't do very many. But this was interesting because it meant, what if I could build a cabinet with one of those devices in, right? You see this is like a modern reincarnation of it. This is just an Ambonic thing. Well, I'll talk about these in another video. And you could kind of mount this inside and use this as the screen and then attach some controls to it. So the first thing really was to kind of work out how's this thing going to look. So I actually made a cardboard mock-up. Yeah, chopped up some cardboard boxes to like get the overall dimensions, see if it looked good, and I based it on like a fairly classic mid-80s type cabinet. It was kind of nominally based on 1943, but I think most of the cabinets of that time looked a bit like this. So I like really went to town with it. I printed out some 1943 artwork, like the bezel to go around the screen, and sized that up accordingly so that the screen from this GP2X could show through the middle. And I printed out some marquee artwork and created a mock-up. And what I wanted to do was I wanted this cabinet to be as small as it could possibly be to fit this GP2X in as the screen, but to still have real proper full-sized arcade controls like the Slab you saw earlier, with one of those Samurai joysticks and some proper clicky buttons. Now this is going to have to be pretty minimal, so one joystick, 2 buttons I think was going to be the max. It didn't really matter because this had only played like really early arcade games anyway, so it didn't need more than 2 buttons. And then because the panel was so small, I think I put the like start and coin buttons on the front just to squeeze them all in. So all I did really to translate this into the real thing is I got some 6mm MDF and cut out panels to match the shape I'd made in cardboard, like measured it up so that everything was square and a bit more symmetrical, with some wooden strips in the corners holding it all together. Made a separate little control panel, drilled some had to get like a big hole drill bit, spade drill bits to drill some big holes for the buttons and the joystick. Made a panel that the screen would go behind. Had to mount the GP2X on the back. Now, I actually took the GP2X completely to pieces. Like took the screen out, and I experimented with like, are we just going to mount the screen onto this panel and have the innards of this machine separate? But I think in the end it was way too fragile to have like that, and I just mounted the whole GP2X behind the screen, behind the like screen surround panel, mounted the whole thing in there. And there was another like hobbyist device with this called a breakout box, GP2X breakout box, that you could plug into the GP2X, and then you could plug devices into it. So I had this like crazy daisy chain of electronics inside this cabinet, going from the GP2X to the breakout box to the arcade controller. Now this arcade controller is called an iPack. In fact, it was a iPack Mini to fit in here, made by Ultimark. They're amazing. And then from there, like wires out to the joystick and the individual buttons. And you can see on one of these photos, I'll find one to show you, where I've got all of these crazy wires all rammed inside this case. So yeah, that worked, and I was quite pleased with that. So I had it up and running. Like as I was creating the cabinet and you know, putting primer coat on the panels, I would like keep testing it, putting all the electronics in, putting all the buttons in, and just seeing how it played. I was quite pleased with it, but the screen was a bit on the small side. It really was quite small. So I also experimented with using a small portable camping TV. You could get these little tiny TVs with LCD screens that had like a composite in signal that I could get off the breakout box. So I think I experimented with that as well. And the picture quality again was terrible on all of these. It was nothing like you'd get on any modern devices at all. But at the time it was like, it worked. I also experimented with, I used this iPack arcade controller board for wiring up all the buttons and joystick. I also experimented with, and I don't know why I did this, looking back I've got photos of this, taking apart a cheap game controller and using the PCB from inside and wiring directly onto the contacts on this board. So you effectively got a USB, the innards of a USB game controller wired direct to your controls. Not quite sure why I did that, but I think in the end I went with the iPack because it made the wiring a lot simpler and a lot less fragile, because my soldering was like super novice level soldering. And so eventually there I had it. I had generation 1 of, and I called it the Diddy Cab, this tiny arcade cabinet. But it wasn't this thing. It was a bit smaller, and it was somewhat primitive, and it could only play the games that the GP2X could play, which wasn't very many at all. So for a while I was happy. Done, right? Well, yes. At first, the thing is, this GP2X wasn't that powerful. It could only run the really old games, and they're fun for a while, right? But after a while, you want to play more than Space Invaders and Juno First and Gravitar, great though they are. I wanted to play all the games, I wanted to play the games that I remember from the 80s, like Outrun and R-Type and Afterburner and Space Harrier, and then like more of the games. How on earth were we going to do this? We needed more power, and how are we going to get more power? With a PC, of course. So miniaturization of PCs hadn't really got off the ground at this point. PCs were just these enormous, gigantic boxes the size of 2 or 3 toasters that made a huge noise. But VIA had just released a new form factor, the Mini ITX form factor for motherboards, and they were about 140 mil square, so just about usable for a miniature, PC in an arcade box. But guess what? This was like half an inch too big for my cabinet. It wouldn't fit. So I decided I would use one of those, but I'd make a new cabinet that was just exactly the right size to stick one of these Mini ITX motherboards in the bottom, like so it just fitted, which meant scaling the whole thing up by like 5% or something. At this point, this is way before the Raspberry Pi or anything super mini like this, but the Mini ITX looked like the thing. And it was a hobbyist board. There was a website where people would stick their miniaturized hidden PCs in different models, photos on there. You'd have like, people would have like models of R2-D2 or one that's in a cigar case or a Lego model or all kinds of things. So I thought, I'm going to make an mini arcade, but slightly less mini, with one of these in, and then I can put full-blown proper MAME on it with Windows, whatever Windows version it would have been at the time, XP, 98, one of those, and then that opened the doors to having every emulator you wanted on there, so you could run anything at all. So I went with kind of exactly the same format as before, but I upped it from 2 buttons to 4 buttons. Now that is now this case. But it's not the end of the story by any means, because there's more has happened to it. But this is the slightly upgraded case that we used. And one thing I really needed, desperately needed, was a better screen than that terrible little micro camping LCD television set, which you can imagine from like 25 years ago was awful. But you couldn't get all of these nice hobbyist LCD panels that you can get now. But I did find out that the PlayStation 1 re-release version of the original PlayStation had a portable 5-inch screen like add-on for it. And this thing like plugged into the back of the PlayStation, and you got an actual 5-inch LCD panel. And again, by modern standards, the picture quality wasn't that great, but it was way better than the stuff I'd been using up to this point. So I got one of those. It was 320 by 240 resolution, which is perfect for most arcade games. And I kind of had a bit of a seed of an idea that this screen would be small enough so that I could rig up a panel to mount it on, where I could mount the screen either horizontally or vertically and be able to change it around for vertical format or horizontal format screens. Now, I don't think this worked out in the end. I think I just went with a hard-wired vertical format, because vertical format was kind of the more novelty. You could play horizontal stuff on all consoles and on your TV, but I was quite interested in the vertical format games. I carried on using one of these Ultimark iPad things, and I've upped the button count on this one. So as well as 4 buttons on the top, I had 2 on the side because it couldn't fit 6 on the top. So extra buttons, lots of wiring. You can see all the wires crammed into the bottom of this cabinet, trying desperately to keep them off the motherboard, which was passive cooled, so I didn't want that overheating too much. And it all came together quite nicely, and I used some like half deconstructed PC speakers for the sound, and they came out of little holes just above the screen, so they would blast sound down to you. Now the sound was extremely tinny and rubbish because PC speakers of the time were tinny and rubbish, the ones that size anyway. But using all these different components, they all worked well together, and it made a most amazing mini arcade cabinet, and I could play all my favourite arcade games on there, no problem at all. Job done, and it was fantastic. Fast forward 10, 15 more years, and this thing was still on my desk, and I still used it from time to time, but it was starting to get a bit dated. You know, there was a whole new generation of games I wanted to play on it, all the like harder to emulate stuff, and you know, emulators for other systems, and yeah, the screen was still pretty shocking, and technology, like screen technology, had definitely stepped up a lot in the intervening years. So I fancied a bigger, better screen, maybe a bigger, better processor. This thing struggled to play some of those games that I used to play on my PlayStation 2, like Dodonpachi, Deojo. It struggled to emulate those at full speed. But, you know, modern mini PCs will do that no problem at all. And so it was time for another refresh. So this time we kept the same case because, you know, it was big enough now. I could actually go smaller now. So it's a bit old and battered, but we kept the same case. And we completely gutted the inside and replaced all the innards. And so instead of that enormous mini ITX motherboard, we replaced it. I replaced it with, I don't know if you'll be able to see this, like a modern mini PC. This one's called a Chewy Lark Box, but there's all kinds of mini PCs like that. I think that was like £99 or something. And that can run like Windows 10, anything you like. And we replaced the screen with this much better 7-inch LCD widescreen. Now, the screens were a bit of a problem. I wanted an 8-inch 4x3, but that was a bit too big to fit. So we've gone with a 7-inch widescreen that I've mounted vertically, which means at least vertical format games will look absolutely magnificent. The rather aged PC speakers are replaced with a little sound bar that is in the top that you can't see. And so now we have it up to date. It will run just about anything that I want to throw at it. And it's about 20 years old. So one other thing I thought I'd show you is, so in this final iteration, if you remember, the previous one was running, I can't actually remember, I think it was probably Windows XP, maybe Windows 98. So that was another reason why it was getting a bit long in the tooth. So this upgraded version, once we stuck the new mini PC Chewy Larkbox thing in it, we could do with definitely upgrading the software as well. And so these days there's loads of good emulator distros. So this is running a version of Batacera, which is just a ready-made Linux distribution with everything on it, all the emulators. All you need to do is load it up with your games and away you go. And it's designed like specifically for these kind of projects. So you can just go into all your different emulators. So we've got two arcade emulators on here, MAME and Final Burn Neo, because some work best on each. So yep, this version of Batacera is really nice because you can put it into sort of gallery mode and you could end up with a full screen scrollable gallery of games. I kind of prefer this format to the more traditional like list of names with a screenshot that comes up on the side when you pick one. You can see like whole pages worth at once, and it's all operated through the controls. So you just go up and down and choose your game with the stick and press the button to run it, and then there's a hotkey combination to quit the game. Makes it a lot easier to use than the old version, where I think if it was running Windows you had to maybe you even had to plug a mouse into the back of it to kick MAME off to start with and choose your game, which was much more clunky. And here we are playing Dragon Blaze, your typical vertical style 80s, 90s bullet hell shooter. And as you can see on this nice like vertical format screen, it looks fantastic. It's nice and big for the size of the panel. Great. One definite downside to this arrangement, which maybe we'll fix in a future project, is that any horizontal format games then are back to a really small screen. So I don't tend to play the horizontal ones on here, and we definitely need a new format of cabinet that allows a rotating screen so you can play hori or verti games all on the one cabinet, I think. So I've kind of discovered with these projects as you go along that you can really, your imagination is the only limit. There's so many things you can do, and they're great fun to build. This was great. I think I probably had as much fun building it as I have done playing with it, because they're all like rapid fire, short term games that you play on here. So you're not going to be on here for hours. You just might boot it up for a quick go of R-Type or something like that. But it's amazing what you can do with no skills whatsoever, and you kind of learn as you're going. And I screwed it up in so many ways as I was going along, but I'm quite pleased with the result. And I'm now thinking, now this has been renovated and is now working, and we've got this 4-button layout on here and the joystick, and all the games that I can play on there are fantastic. And now I'm thinking, maybe what's next? Do I want to make one with an actual rotating screen in it so it will properly do vertical and horizontal format games nicely? Do I want one with a spinner on it so that I can use it to play Arkanoid, or a trackball for Crystal Castles mainly, because I quite like that? Or maybe something with really clever with an interchangeable control panels where you can take out one set of controls and plug in another one, and they just slot in and out. And I can definitely do with improving the ergonomics of this thing, because although it's shaped like a proper arcade machine, this bit is very high off the desk. I think it'd be way better with the controls pushed down low and the screen brought up front and centre. So your hands can rest more comfortably. You've seen in some of the kind of recent miniature reproductions that, like the Taito Egret 2 and the other one, there's 2 or 3 other like mini arcades that have been made by some of these arcade manufacturers, and they all do it. They put the controls down low. So maybe there'll be another project in the offing at some point. It's one of those things where once you get the bug, you always want to do more. But I thought I would take you through kind of my journey of building this over like 20 years, over two or three generations of build, because it's just such a lot of fun to do. And I'm sure that you've seen plenty of other projects out there on the interwebs. And you know, I don't have any great electronic skills or any great carpentry skills, but I had a lot of fun building it, and it's, you know, there's no other one like it. So if you ever felt the urge to do something like this, I say go for it, but just keep it fairly simple to start with, make a prototype and have fun with it. And that's it. I'll see you all next time.